The smell hit her before the lights did. Marisol Vega pressed the key card against the reader and waited for the magnetic click. And in the half-second before the fluorescence buzzed on, she breathed it in. Old cardboard, gun oil, the faint chemical sweetness of evidence bags that had been sitting in climate-controlled air since before some of the rookies upstairs were in high school. She knew that smell the way she knew her own apartment, intimately, without affection. The door swung open. She was already irritated. It was 6:48 in the morning and she'd been awake since 4, lying on her back staring at the water stain on her bedroom ceiling, running through the Holden case the way you worry a loose tooth. 3 weeks to trial. The defense had filed a motion to exclude the burner phone, chain of custody issue. Some clerical error in the transfer log between the field evidence tech and the main locker. And the Ada, a 29-year-old named Brianna Chu who wore blazers that still had the crease from the store hanger, had called Vega at 9 p.m. to tell her she needed to personally verify the item's documentation before the 9 a.m. hearing. So here she was. The evidence room at the Harwick Police Department occupied the entire basement level of the building, a converted factory space from the 1940s that the city had purchased in 1987 and spent 12 years turning into something that vaguely resembled a functional municipal building. The ceilings were high, 12 feet at least, with exposed ductwork painted over so many times it had lost its original shape. The shelving units were gray steel, floor to ceiling, organized by case number with plastic label holders that were supposed to be updated whenever items were transferred but rarely were. The floor was sealed concrete, a color between bone and ash, and your footsteps came back at you slightly wrong, like the echo couldn't quite commit. Vega walked the center aisle toward the active case section, holding her coffee with both hands. She was 41, not tall. Her hair had been the same since she was 32, dark, pulled back tight enough that it stopped being a decision and started being a fact. She had the particular posture of someone who had spent years making herself smaller in rooms full of loud men, and the particular stillness that came from having learned, early and at some cost, that stillness was itself a kind of information collection. She noticed things she did not always announce that she had. The burner phone from the Holden arrest was logged as item 14C in box 2201H. She found the aisle, found the shelf level, ran her finger along the label holders. The boxes here were banker's boxes, cream-colored, each one tagged with the case number, the arresting officer, the date of intake, and the evidence tech's initials. She found 2201 and pulled the box, set it on the small work table at the end of the aisle. The seal was intact. She photographed it with her phone, then broke it, logged the time in her notebook, 6:51 a.m., and opened the box. The phone was there, bag, tag, chain of custody form attached. She cross-referenced the IMEI number on the tag against the field tech's original report, found the match, checked the transfer log. There was the clerical error Brianna Chu had flagged. The transfer date was entered as the 14th when the arrest had occurred on the 11th, and the tech had initialed in the wrong column. It looked sloppy, but it wasn't a chain of custody break, just a data entry mistake. She could fix this. She'd need the tech's signed correction and a supplemental report, which was annoying but manageable. She replaced the phone, resealed the box with a fresh evidence tape strip from the roll she'd grabbed at the duty desk, initialed and dated it, and returned it to the shelf. She should have left then. The box next to 2201H was slightly out of alignment. Not dramatically, maybe half an inch, the front edge jutting past the others. It was the kind of thing you didn't notice if you weren't already looking at that section of shelf. But Vega had just spent 90 seconds with her hands on the shelving unit, and the misalignment was there. And she registered it the way she registered most small wrong things, with a quiet, reflexive unease that she couldn't entirely explain and didn't try to. She straightened the box. The label read 1608W August 2016. The initials were DP. DP was Dale Prout. He'd been a detective in 2016 working homicide before his promotion to lieutenant commander of the Criminal Investigations Division in 2019. He ran about a third of the department now. He had a photo with the mayor on his office wall and a second photo, almost the same, slightly better lighting, with the congressman. Vega had no particular feeling about Dale Prout except the low, constant vigilance she applied to everyone in the building above a certain rank. He was competent in the ways that mattered publicly and careless in the ways that rarely got examined. He was charming at department functions and had a habit of touching people on the shoulder when he talked to them, a fraction longer than was comfortable, just long enough to establish something. She started to walk away. She walked 4 steps and stopped. The box was too light. She'd felt it when she straightened it, that brief contact with the side and the weight had been wrong. These boxes, when they contained a full case file and the associated physical evidence, had a particular heft. Even when they were mostly paper, they had weight. Box 1608W had moved too easily. It was either empty or close to it. Evidence boxes from 2016 were supposed to be in long-term storage, not in the active case section, and they were never supposed to feel like that. She stood in the aisle for a moment. The HVAC system cycled on overhead, a low, sustained hum that vibrated slightly in her back teeth. Somewhere in the building's upper floors, she could hear the muffled sound of the early shift starting, a door, a radio, someone's boot heels on the floor above. She pulled the box. Inside, a single evidence bag sealed containing what appeared to be a handgun, a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, blue steel 4-inch barrel. The bag was labeled with the case number, the item number, item 1A, the date of intake, and the evidence tag number, EV88410. The original evidence tag, the small cardboard rectangle attached to the bag's zip seal, had been filled out in a neat, compressed hand. She photographed everything before she touched it. She read the case summary printed on the exterior of the box, a single typed sheet in a plastic sleeve. Case 1608W, deceased, Marcus Darnell Webb, 34, no fixed address. Manner of death, homicide, single gunshot wound to the chest. Investigating officer D. Prout. Case status, closed, ruled justifiable homicide, October 2016. The weapon recovered at scene was listed as a .38 Smith & Wesson revolver, serial number 8841 RKS. She looked at the gun through the evidence bag. The gun's serial number was on the frame just ahead of the grip where Smith & Wesson put it. She had to tilt the bag slightly to read it clearly in the fluorescent light. The number on the gun was 8841 RKS. That matched the evidence tag. She put the box back exactly as she'd found it, including the half-inch protrusion, and took a photograph of the shelf from 2 angles. She noted the time, 7:04 a.m. She signed out at the duty desk, told the sergeant on duty she'd confirmed her item, and walked upstairs. In the stairwell between the 2nd and 3rd floor, she stopped and leaned against the wall and stayed very still, the way she sometimes did when she was working through something that didn't quite have a shape yet. The fluorescent in the stairwell had been failing for months, flickering on a 6-second cycle, and it threw her in and out of shadow as she stood there. The problem wasn't the serial number matched. The problem was the evidence tag number. EV88410, she'd seen that number before, not in case 1608W, in a completely different case. She was almost certain of it. The kind of certain that wasn't quite certain yet, that needed verification, but that sat in her gut with enough weight that she didn't dismiss it. She had a good memory for numbers. It was a quality she developed deliberately, in the way you develop a quality when the alternative is trusting paperwork, and trusting paperwork has already cost you once in a way you don't talk about. EV88410. She needed to check the system. The Criminal Investigations Division was mostly empty at 7:15. A couple of the night shift guys were at their desks doing end-of-shift paperwork, moving slowly, and one of the administrative aides was at her station by the door. But the main floor, the grid of desks with their monitors and stacked files and the particular visual noise of active investigations, was quiet enough that Vega could hear her own breathing when she sat down. She logged in. The department's evidence management system, ACE's Asset and Case Evidence System, a name generated by someone who liked acronyms more than logic, was slow in the mornings, the servers apparently warming up like the building itself. She waited, typed in the tag number, EV88410. One result. Case 1608W, Marcus Webb, the .38 revolver. She sat back, ran her thumb along the edge of her notebook. Typed again, serial number 8841 RKS. One result, same case. She stared at the screen. The tag number matched the serial number and the case. Everything was consistent. On paper, there was nothing wrong. But the tag number. She'd seen it somewhere else. She was sure of it now in the way she got sure of things sometimes, without being able to explain the mechanism, something in her peripheral memory, a document she'd handled, a number she'd scanned in passing. The brain filed things before you asked it to. She went to her case files. Not Ace's, her own records, the physical files she kept in the two-drawer cabinet next to her desk that she'd inherited from the previous occupant of the desk and had reorganized entirely in her first week. She wasn't supposed to keep physical copies of documents beyond their standard retention period, but she kept them anyway, in violation of a departmental policy that was violated so routinely by so many detectives that it had effectively ceased to function as a policy. She looked through 2019 files first, nothing surfaced. She moved backward, 2018, 2017. In March 2017, she'd been assigned as secondary on an officer-involved shooting. Detective work had gone to Prout, he'd been lead by rank, and she'd handled the witness statements and the scene documentation. The subject had been a 22-year-old named Devont Rains, who'd been stopped for a broken taillight on Meredith Avenue at 11:40 p.m., and the primary officer on the stop had claimed Rains had produced a weapon, and the officer had discharged his weapon twice, and Rains had died on the sidewalk before the ambulance arrived, and the weapon Rains had supposedly produced had been recovered at the scene. A .38 revolver. She found the file. She found the evidence log. The weapon in the Rains case, collected by Prout himself as lead investigator, had been logged under evidence tag number EV88410. She read it twice, then she read it a third time because sometimes you misread things and the brain supplies what it expects to see rather than what's there. EV88410. Case 2017 RN Rains, a .38 Smith & Wesson revolver, serial number listed on the field log as 9012 AVS. Not 8841 RKS. A different serial number, the same evidence tag. She put both documents flat on her desk, looked from one to the other. The HVAC in the CID office was better than in the evidence room, quieter, but the building still made its old factory sounds. The tick of expanding metal, the groan of something structural adjusting to the morning temperature differential. She was aware of the other detectives in the room in the way you became aware of people when you were trying to appear not to be doing something. She photographed both documents. She put the Rains file back in her cabinet exactly as it had been. She drank the last of her coffee, which was cold. Then she went to the Rains case in ACES and searched for the weapon evidence. The tag number in the system for the Rains weapon was EV92231. Not EV88410. Someone had changed it. Brianna Chu's 9 a.m. hearing went fine. The judge accepted the supplemental correction affidavit, denied the exclusion motion, and Vega sat in the third row of the gallery for 20 minutes looking at the wood paneling while Chu argued with the composure of someone 10 years older. And then it was over and Vega walked out into the February cold, which in Harwick, Ohio hit like a wet sheet. And she stood on the courthouse steps and watched her breath and thought about what she knew and what she didn't, and what the distance between those two things might cost her. She knew a single evidence tag number had appeared on documents in two separate cases, associated with two different weapons and two different serial numbers. She knew the version in ACES for the Rains case had been altered to show a different tag number than what appeared on the original field log. She knew Dale Prout had been the lead investigator on both the Webb and Rains cases. She didn't know how old the alteration in ACES was or who'd made it. She didn't know whether the physical weapon currently sitting in the 1608W box was the weapon from the Webb scene or the weapon from the Rains scene or some third weapon entirely. She didn't know whether the tag number discrepancy was the result of deliberate fraud or some cascading clerical catastrophe of the kind that happened in evidence rooms with depressing frequency, though the ACES alteration argued against accident. She didn't know how deep this went or in what direction. She did know that she was now standing on courthouse steps, having spent the last 2 hours quietly documenting what might be evidence of a crime committed by a lieutenant commander in her own department, and that she was going to have to be very careful about what she did next, and more specifically, about who she told. She called her sister in Columbus, talked for 4 minutes about nothing in particular, and drove back to the department. Over the next 8 days she was careful. The thing about being careful was that it had a weight, not visible, Not anything you could point to, but she felt it the same way she'd have felt a slight fever, background, persistent, coloring everything without disrupting it. She ate her lunch at her desk. She answered questions with her normal economy. She did not vary her routine in any way that a person watching her would notice, and she operated under the assumption that someone might be watching, not because she had evidence of surveillance, but because she had enough experience with institutions to know that institutional self-protection was reflexive and often preceded the conscious decision to protect. She did not revisit the evidence room. She did not reopen the ACES records for the RAINs or web cases from her own terminal. She'd used a general evidence audit query the first time, one that would leave no obvious search trail, but a direct case file pull would flag differently. She worked her normal caseload, a residential burglary series in the Eastside district that had generated 14 reports in 6 weeks, a domestic violence case headed to trial, an aggravated assault with 3 witnesses who all had different stories, and one of whom was lying so transparently that she'd had to look at her notes to keep from saying so during the interview. She was herself. She was quiet and methodical, and she kept her face the same way she kept it in interrogation rooms. Interested, not alarmed, always with the faint impression that she'd already heard whatever you were going to say. She ran the serial number 8841 RKS through the National Crime Information Center. The result came back in 40 minutes. The weapon had originally been purchased in 2009 by a private citizen in Knoxville, Tennessee, subsequently reported stolen in 2013, and then this was the part she stared at for a long time, re-entered into the database in 2021, as recovered property by the Harwick Police Department's Property Crimes Division. Listed as recovered at a burglary scene, never claimed by the original owner, transferred to department inventory. She ran the second number, serial 9012 AVS, the RAIN's weapon per the original field log. It came back as manufactured in 2011, never registered to a private citizen, originally sold to a wholesale distributor in Georgia, and then nothing. The trail ended at the distributor level, which meant it had likely moved through the secondary market without registration, which was not unusual for weapons recovered at crime scenes. Then she ran 9012 AVS through a second query, HPD property records, whether the department had ever had the weapon in its custody. It had, logged by Harwick PD Property Crimes in 2014, listed as a weapon recovered during a drug bust on Clement Street, transferred to the evidence room under case number 1402C. Disposition on that case, charges dropped, evidence retained per standard policy. Case 1402C, she looked up the lead detective on that case. D. Pruitt. She sat with that for a while. What she was beginning to see, not clearly, not yet, more like something you see at the edge of your vision when you stop trying to look directly at it, was the shape of a system. Not a single act of evidence manipulation, but something that had been operating for long enough to have its own logic, its own internal consistency. Pruitt had access to weapons in the evidence room that had been sitting there for years, belonging to closed cases with no active litigation, weapons that were essentially invisible, parked in storage, waiting for a mandatory destruction date that might be a decade away. If you needed a weapon to appear at a scene, you took one of those. You documented it with the original case's tag number, which matched nothing in current ACEs because nobody was looking at closed cases from 2014. Then later, you cleaned the ACES record, updated the tag number to something new, moved the paper trail, made it look like the weapon at the scene had always been that weapon. The problem was the physical item. You still had it. You couldn't destroy it, too much documentation. So you put it back, just not in its original box. You put it in a different closed cases box, one with a similar weapon type, knowing that nobody did physical verification on long-term storage items unless there was active litigation forcing them to. Unless someone was looking for a phone and had a good memory for numbers. She bought a new notebook, a different brand than her usual Moleskine, purchased at the CVS on Garland Street with cash, and started keeping notes in it that she never brought to the department. On the 5th day, Pruitt stopped by her desk. She heard him before she saw him. He had a particular walk, a deliberate rhythm that communicated something about his confidence in the space he moved through, the subtle implication that rooms arranged themselves for him rather than around him. She was reading a forensic report on the burglary series when his shadow crossed her desk, and she looked up with the expression she used for exactly these situations. Open, mildly curious, the face of someone who was in the middle of something and had been interrupted by something of equivalent interest. Vega, he smiled with the easy, slightly asymmetrical warmth of someone who'd been told he had a good smile and had learned to deploy it with precision. You went down to evidence last week. For the Holden audit, she said, the Ada had a chain of custody question. How'd it go? Resolved, clerical error in the transfer log, Tex filing a correction. He nodded, one hand resting on the partition that separated her workstation from Jensen's adjacent desk. He was wearing a shirt the color of old brick, no tie, sleeves rolled to the forearm in the manner of someone who wanted to appear accessible. His watch was silver and conservative and probably expensive. Good, I want to make sure we're solid going into that trial. We are, she said. Brianna Chu, he made a small face, a fond exasperation. She calls me sometimes at 9:30 at night, which I appreciate the dedication, but he shook his head and there was a pause, the kind that was about a second too long, and in that second she was aware of his eyes doing something she couldn't quite name. A slight narrowing, a quality of attention that was different from the conversational attention he'd been performing. Anything else down there? He said. The tone hadn't changed. The casualness was intact, but the question had a shape to it that was distinct from casual. Just the Holden items, she said. She held the eye contact. Not challengingly, just naturally, the way you held eye contact when you were telling the truth and had nothing to manage. The locker was pretty quiet at that hour. 6-something in the morning. He made a sound that was nominally a laugh. You're dedicated like Chew. He tapped the partition twice lightly, a small percussion. Good work. He walked away. She watched his reflection in her darkened monitor screen until he turned the corner, and then she looked back at the forensic report and stayed very still for approximately 30 seconds. He'd known what time she'd been in the evidence room, which meant he'd checked the sign-in log, which meant something in the last 5 days had prompted him to look. She finished the forensic report, she ate her lunch at her desk, she did not change anything about the rest of her day. That evening, in the new notebook she kept at home, she wrote the time and the date and the verbatim content of the conversation with Prout, as precisely as she could reconstruct it, including the pause length and the expression she hadn't been able to name but that she now, writing it down, decided to describe as assessment. She wasn't certain what he knew or suspected. She wasn't certain he knew anything. What she was certain of was that a man who checks sign-in logs and asks casual questions about evidence room visits is a man who is checking something. And a man who is checking something is, in some important sense, already moving. She needed someone who wasn't inside the building. Her first instinct was wrong, and she knew it was wrong before she acted on it. The instinct was to call the FBI field office in Columbus because the FBI was the obvious move, the institutional response, the thing that was supposed to happen. But she'd been a cop for 16 years and she knew that obvious moves left traces that ran back through official channels. And official channels in Harwick ran through a police chief named Thomas Garrett who'd worked under Prout's supervision for 4 years before their ranks inverted, and she had no read on Garrett she trusted. She thought for a long time about a particular name. Celeste Monroe had been an assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of Ohio for 11 years. Vega had worked with her on a federal firearms trafficking case in 2020, briefly, enough to develop an assessment. Monroe was small and sharp-featured and had a habit of asking questions that seemed simple until you were halfway through answering them and realized they weren't. She didn't waste language. She had a reputation in the AUSA's office for taking cases that were procedurally complicated and making them clean, which was a different skill from the one that got you on television. Vega called her on a personal cell, she'd kept the number, as she kept most numbers, on a Tuesday evening from the parking lot of a Kroger on the west side of the city, with the engine running and the heater on. Monroe picked up on the third ring. Vega, slight pause, it's been a while. It has, I'm sorry to use this number. It's fine, what's going on? I need 20 minutes, not on the phone, can we do coffee somewhere? Monroe didn't say is this official or what's this about. She said, tomorrow work I've got a window at 7. 7's fine. Grounds on 5th you know it. I'll find it. She drove home on surface streets, avoiding the highway because the highway gave her too much unstructured time, and too much unstructured time lately had a tendency to generate the kind of thinking that didn't help. She stopped at a red light on Belcher Avenue and watched a man in a down jacket walk a small dog in the rain, and something about the ordinariness of it, the specific, particular ordinariness, the dog pulling slightly against the leash, the man's shoulders hunched, steadied her in a way she couldn't have explained. Her knee was bothering her. It had been since November, a tendon thing, not serious enough to deal with and not comfortable enough to ignore. She was aware of it particularly on stairs and particularly when she was tense, as though her body directed attention to existing injuries when it had nowhere else to put the discomfort. She made dinner. She watched 40 minutes of a documentary about deep-sea submersibles that she had no particular interest in but that required no emotional engagement. She slept badly. Monroe listened without interrupting. She was the kind of person who drank her coffee and let you talk, not performing patience but actually patient, in a way that Vega found unusual enough to notice. The coffee shop was narrow and warm, a corner location with exposed brick and the particular ambient noise of an espresso machine that ran continuously, and nobody within earshot was close enough to matter. But Monroe had still chosen the table farthest from the bar, with sightlines to both the front door and the side exit, which told Vega something about how Monroe moved through the world. When Vega was done, Monroe set her cup down and looked at the table for a moment. How much of this is documented, she said. It wasn't a question about whether, it was a question about how much. Everything I've described. Photographs of the physical evidence, copies of the relevant field logs, the ACES screenshot before and after the discrepancy. I pulled a before version from an archival backup that gets run to an external server every Sunday. She'd spent 4 evenings figuring out how to access the archival backup through a channel that didn't require her credentials. And my own logs, times, dates, what I observed, what I found. The archival backup access. That's going to be a conversation. Yes, it is. Monroe's expression didn't change. How many cases do you think we're talking about? I don't know. I've identified 2 with certainty. If the pattern is what I think it is, he planted weapons at officer-involved shooting scenes, subsequent evidence alteration, it could go back 8 or 10 years. I stopped looking because every search I run increases the exposure. Monroe nodded. Smart. She picked up her coffee again. Have you talked to anyone in the department? No. Your immediate supervisor? Lieutenant Hargrove? No. Garrison? The chief? No. Good. Monroe looked at the window. Outside, Harwick was doing what it did in February: gray sky, gray buildings, the occasional splash of slush from a passing car. I need to ask you something and I need you to think about it before you answer. Okay. Is there anything in your record, your history with the department, any ongoing personal or professional conflict with Prout or anyone in his chain, that a defense attorney is going to put in front of a jury and use to reframe this as a vendetta? Vega thought about it, not because she didn't know the answer but because Monroe had asked her to think about it, and Monroe had asked her to think about it for a reason. No open conflicts, no formal complaints, no grievances, no personnel issues. Prout and I have worked together maybe 6 times in 16 years, there's no history there. Any history that isn't formal. The word history was doing some work. He said something to me once at a department function. 2021, something that I let pass and didn't report and that I've since wished I had reported but didn't. What did he say? We were discussing a witness in a case I was working. He said, and I'm being exact here, he said, sometimes you have to decide if being right is worth what it costs you. And then he walked away. Monroe's face did something small, in context. In context, he was nominally talking about the case. The witness had given a statement that contradicted his own prior statement, and I was deciding whether to pursue it aggressively or let it develop. But he said it while making eye contact and not walking away immediately, and I was aware that there was a second conversation happening under the one I could cite. Noted that's not nothing, but it's also not much. Monroe leaned back. Okay, here's what happens next. I take this to my supervisor this afternoon. We open an inquiry, quiet, no paper that touches HPD channels. I'm going to need your documentation, all of it, everything you've described, and I'm going to need it in a way that doesn't implicate you in anything procedurally irregular. The archival backup. I'll have someone handle the framing. You walked me through what you found. We pulled the backup through the AUSA's request authority as part of a preliminary inquiry. The sequence can be made to work. She said it flatly, not defensively, in the tone of someone describing a practical problem rather than an ethical one. Okay. How many people know you've been looking at this? Nobody. Good, keep it that way, I mean completely. Don't tell your partner, don't tell anyone you socialize with in the department, don't tell your sister. She paused. You have a sister in Columbus? Yes. Don't tell her. Another pause, slightly longer. How are you doing with this? The question caught Vega slightly off guard, which didn't happen often. I'm fine. Monroe looked at her with the expression of someone who has heard "I'm fine" used to mean exactly the opposite enough times to develop a response to it that is neither dismissal nor excessive concern. Okay, she said, let's get to work. The federal inquiry that Celeste Monroe opened on a Wednesday morning in February, under an authorization code that appeared in no publicly accessible record, was designated Operation Cornerstone by the FBI field office that was brought in 3 days later. The FBI liaison was a special agent named Calvin Reese, who was 48, built like a high school linebacker 20 years past his last game, and who had a way of sitting in a chair that made him seem like he was prepared to remain in it for however long it took. He'd spent 6 years in the Public Corruption Unit in Chicago before transferring to the Ohio field office, and he had an encyclopedic knowledge of the particular ways that law enforcement officers convinced themselves that what they were doing was not what it was. Vega met him once in the first 2 weeks briefly in a conference room at the AUSA's office. He looked at her the way experienced investigators looked at sources, cataloging, assessing, deciding what to believe and how much. Walk me through the weight thing, he said, the box being too light. Bankers' boxes in that section average between 8 and 12 pounds. Empty, they're under a pound. A single bagged handgun is roughly 2 pounds plus the box itself. I'd estimate I was feeling maybe 2.5–3 pounds total. You moved the box how? Repositioned it, contact with the side panel, both hands brief. You trust that assessment, the weight? Yes. He looked at her for a moment. That's a pretty small thing. I know. Most people don't catch pretty small things. I know. He nodded slowly and wrote something in his notebook. Whatever he was deciding about her, he kept it to himself. The investigation that Reese and Monroe ran over the following 11 weeks was invisible to the Harwick Police Department in the way that certain kinds of pressure are invisible. You don't feel the specific source, but you feel the effect, and sometimes you start moving in ways that reveal where the pressure is coming from. There were no visible signs, no additional personnel in the building, no audits that looked like audits. The only anomaly was a request from the city's technology department, routed through the city manager's office, for a system maintenance window on the ACE's servers, which was so routine as to generate almost no notice, and which allowed a forensic team from the FBI to create a complete image of the database, including all modification logs, access logs, and the metadata that ACES generated every time a record was edited. The modification logs were thorough. Every change to any record in ACES had been recorded automatically since a 2018 system upgrade tied to the user credentials of whoever was logged in when the change was made. What the forensic team found, working backward through 7 years of records, was a pattern of modifications to evidence records in officer-involved shooting cases, 17 cases in total, that had occurred outside of normal business hours, from a single administrative terminal in the evidence room, under credentials belonging to an evidence unit sergeant named Roy Ferris. Ferris was 53, 19 years on the force, and he had worked in the evidence unit for 8 of those years. He had a daughter at Ohio State, and a boat he kept on Lake Erie, and a mortgage that, according to the financial records the FBI subpoenaed without his knowledge, he had been somehow paying since 2017 on a salary that shouldn't have covered it. The forensic accounting took 4 weeks, and found a total of $340,000 that could not be explained by Ferris's documented income, traced through 2 separate LLC accounts to a property management company in Columbus that was effectively a shell. The property management company's sole other business relationship was a private security firm registered to a holding company whose registered agent was a woman named Patricia Pruitt. Pruitt's wife. Vega was not in those meetings. She was not part of the investigative team. She was a cooperating witness and a source, and Monroe had been precise and firm about keeping her at arm's length from the active investigation for reasons that were both legal and protective. What Monroe told her in their periodic check-ins at the grounds on 5th was, "We're building it, and then it's bigger than you thought, and then on a rainy Thursday in April we're going to move next week." The weeks in between were the hardest part, not because of the fear of exposure, though that was present, quiet and constant as a held note, but because of the particular difficulty of being physically present in the same building as someone you were helping to unmake, every weekday, often multiple times a day, with the absolute requirement that nothing show. Pruitt's office was 2 floors above hers. They shared a break room on Tuesdays when he stayed late for the division briefings. He nodded to her in hallways. Once in the elevator he held the door for her and said, "Cold out there today," and she said, "Getting there," and they rode up 4 floors together with the music that the elevator played, a soft instrumental arrangement of something she didn't recognize, and she was aware of him standing 6 inches to her left, the slight smell of his aftershave, the way he stood with his weight forward, the way people stood when they were used to occupying the front of a room. He got off at his floor, the doors closed. She stood in the elevator alone and breathed. There was no moment during those 11 weeks where she felt certain. That was the thing nobody told you about doing something like this. You expected, maybe, a clarity that came with making the right choice, a narrative certainty. Instead, there was just the ongoing question of whether what she'd found was what she thought it was, whether she'd read it correctly, whether the chain she'd constructed from a misaligned box and a tag number and a memory was as solid as it needed to be to hold the weight that was about to be put on it. She lived with that uncertainty the way you lived with a sound in the wall of your apartment, present, identifiable, unresolvable until someone opened the wall and looked. She ran 3 miles 3 mornings a week, a habit she'd maintained for years, the same route through the east end of the Millbrook neighborhood with the hill at the 2-mile mark that never got easier. She called her sister in Columbus once a week and talked about her sister's kids and her sister's job and the renovation her sister was doing on the second bathroom, which had turned into a larger project than anticipated, as these things always did. She did the knee exercises most mornings. She slept enough most nights, though the quality of the sleep had changed, thinner, less restorative, as though some part of her brain had declined to fully disengage from the problem. She did not tell anyone. On Pruitt directly, Vega asked. Pruitt, Ferris, and 2 others, one still on the force, one retired. Can you tell me who's still on the force? Monroe looked at her with the expression she used when a question was reasonable and the answer was no. Not yet. Is it someone I work with directly? Go home, detective, get some sleep. She went home. She did not sleep particularly well. The arrest operation for Dale Pruitt occurred on a Tuesday at 7:20 in the morning, timed for his arrival at the department. He was a creature of routine in early every day, and the predictability of that was the kind of thing that became, in retrospect, one of the small vanities that contributed to a person's undoing. 4 FBI agents and 2 marshals were positioned in the building's parking garage and the lobby, and Reese himself handled the contact, stepping out from beside a support pillar as Pruitt walked from his car toward the elevator. The garage was still half empty at that hour, the particular echoey quiet of a large concrete space without enough bodies to absorb the sound. A single overhead fluorescent was going out 2 rows over, pulsing in a slow, irregular rhythm that made the shadows move in a way that seemed, in the 3 seconds it took for Pruitt to process what he was looking at, almost hallucinatory. Pruitt stopped. He looked at Reese, then at the credentials Reese was holding, then at the 3 agents flanking in a practice spread that covered his exits without looking like it was covering his exits. His face went through a rapid series of adjustments, surprise, then something harder than a controlled blankness that was itself a kind of tell. He was wearing a blue suit and carrying a coffee from the place on the corner he went to every morning. He was holding it when the handcuffs went on. He didn't resist. That was the word that would appear in the arrest report and the media accounts afterward. Did not resist. What it actually meant in the physicality of the moment was that he exhaled once slowly through his nose, and complied with each instruction Reese gave him in a voice that was quiet and specific and entirely without drama. He turned around when told to turn around. He put his hands where he was told to put them. He stood still while the handcuffs were applied. The coffee cup was taken from him gently by one of the other agents and set on the trunk of a nearby car, where it sat and steamed in the cold garage air. "I'd like to call my attorney," he said. His voice was even. "You'll have that opportunity," Reese said. The drive to the federal building took 11 minutes. Vega knew the timing because Monroe had told her it would happen on Tuesday, and she'd sat in her car in the Kroger parking lot on Garland Street, the same lot she'd called Monroe from 3 months ago, and watched the time on her dashboard clock. 7:20, 7:31. She drove to work. She sat at her desk. She answered an email about the burglary series. A colleague named Jensen came in around 9 and said something about the parking garage being blocked off, federal vehicles, and Vega said, and looked back at her screen. By noon, the news had moved through the department like something waterborne, quiet at first, then impossible to avoid. She watched people's reactions and learned things from them. She kept her face the way she kept her face. Roy Ferris was arrested simultaneously at his home in Millbrook Township, in the presence of his wife and, unfortunately, his adult daughter who'd driven down from Columbus the previous evening for reasons unrelated to what was about to happen to her father. Ferris, unlike Prout, cried. He asked to call his daughter before being transported, which was not granted. He was a small, round-faced man with the look of someone who had spent 19 years processing other people's worst moments and had become somewhat numb to them. And the irony of that, or whatever it was, arrived on his face in the back of the federal vehicle, in a way that one of the marshals would describe months later, not without some discomfort, at a bar after a deposition. What Reese's report would later document was that Ferris, in the first 45 minutes of his federal interview, before his attorney arrived, during the period when he'd waived counsel and was talking with what appeared to be genuine distress rather than calculated cooperation, described the system in terms that were at once practical and almost mundane. He called Prout the LTC. He described the procedure for weapon transfers as the swap, in the same flat conversational tone you might use for any departmental procedure. He described his role as keeping the room clean, meaning maintaining the ACE's records in whatever configuration kept the inconsistencies invisible. He said at one point that he'd been told the officers who'd been involved in the shootings were good guys in bad situations, and that he'd believed that early on and then had continued doing what he was doing after he'd stopped believing it, and that the second period was longer than the first, and he was aware that this made the second period worse. He said this last part to Reese directly, looking at him with the flat, slightly unfocused expression of a man saying something he'd been sitting on for a long time. Reese did not respond to it. He asked the next question on his list. The fourth arrestee, the one still on the force, was a detective named Aaron Bluth, who worked in homicide and who was 38 and who had testified in 3 of the 17 officer-involved shooting cases as a supporting witness on scene documentation. Vega had worked beside him at 2 department functions and had no strong impression of him either way. He was quiet, moderately competent, someone who occupied middle space in a room. She thought about that afterward, about how many people who did what Bluth had done were just that, quiet middle space, not notably remarkable in any direction. The federal grand jury convened in mid-May. The indictment, when it came down, was 34 pages and charged Prout with, among other counts, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, conspiracy to deprive citizens of civil rights, and wire fraud. Ferris faced similar charges plus a money laundering count. Bluth pleaded out before the indictment, agreeing to cooperate in exchange for a reduced charge set that his attorney publicly called proportionate to his limited role, which was the kind of thing attorneys said. The civil rights counts were the ones that mattered most, in the way that things can matter on paper and still be insufficient. In the 17 cases the FBI had identified, the planted weapons had been used to support police officers' accounts of justifiable self-defense in shootings where the deceased individual had not in fact been armed. The investigation determined that in at least 11 of those cases, there was no credible alternative evidence that the victim had possessed a weapon. 11 people had died, none of them were alive to participate in what happened next. The media coverage was substantial and then constant, and then in the way of media coverage began to develop the particular fatigue quality that made it feel like static. The national outlets came through for a week, filed their pieces, left. Local television ran the story for months, cycling through the same photographs of Prout in the parking garage, his face doing that controlled blankness, until the photograph became so familiar it stopped conveying anything. The department issued 4 separate statements using the phrase "not representative of our values" in various configurations. Vega was not named in any public reporting as the source of the investigation. Monroe had been careful about that. It would come out eventually, these things did, but the when and how of it coming out was not something Vega controlled, and she'd made her peace with that in approximately the same way she'd made her peace with most things she couldn't control, which was imperfectly and quietly, and with the full knowledge that the peace was partly performance. A review board was convened to examine the department's evidence handling procedures. Vega was asked to testify before it, which she did, in a conference room on the 4th floor of the municipal building, in front of 7 people she mostly recognized. She answered questions for 2 hours. She was precise. She did not editorialize. One of the board members, a retired judge named Halsworth, asked her near the end, "Detective, in your assessment, why did the discrepancy survive as long as it did?" She thought about the question for a moment, not because she didn't have an answer but because she wanted to give him the real one. "People doing evidence audits are looking for what they expect to find," she said. "They're verifying existing records. They're not looking for what shouldn't be there, because looking for what shouldn't be there requires you to have noticed something that doesn't have a category yet. Most people don't do that." She paused. "Most of the time it doesn't matter." Halsworth nodded slowly. "And you did." "I was looking for something else," she said. "I just paid attention while I was doing it." Dale Prout's attorney, a private defense lawyer from Columbus named Edward Cash, who wore cufflinks and spoke in the measured, slightly theatrical way of someone who'd been on TV, filed 17 pretrial motions in the first 3 months after the indictment. The trial date was pushed twice. The legal machinery moved at its own pace, which bore no relationship to any human sense of urgency. Vega was scheduled to testify as a government witness. She attended the first day of trial as a spectator before her own testimony, which was 2 weeks out, and sat in the gallery 3 rows back and watched Dale Prout take his seat at the defense table. He was in a gray suit. His hair, which had been a careful dark brown the last time she'd seen him, had gone visibly grayer in the months since the arrest, not dramatically, not the soap opera overnight transformation, just the quiet acceleration of a process that had been happening anyway. He sat straight. He spoke quietly to Cash twice, leaning slightly to the right. He did not look at the gallery. But she could see his hands. They were flat on the table, relaxed, and she watched them for a while because hands told you things that faces were trained not to. His were still. No drumming, no clasping, none of the restless movement of a man badly frightened. He was sitting in a federal courtroom facing 40 criminal counts, and he had his hands flat on the table and they were still. She found herself thinking about what that required, not in an admiring way. In the way you thought about something that was technically impressive, a particular skill, a particular discipline, without reference to what the skill was being used for. He had spent 22 years learning how to be the calmest person in the room, and the federal indictment had apparently not, at least visibly, exceeded the limits of that capacity. What she felt watching him was something she couldn't fit into a clean category, not satisfaction, not triumph, something more in the register of fatigue, or perhaps the particular quiet that came after a long sustained effort finally concluded. Like setting down something you'd been carrying for a while and becoming aware for the first time of how heavy it had been. During the prosecution's opening statement, delivered by a young AUSA named Marcus Webb, who happened to share a name with the first victim, and who seemed either unaware of or untroubled by the coincidence, Prout's expression stayed in that controlled neutral territory she'd seen in the parking garage photograph. He looked like a man listening to something he disagreed with but was too experienced to show disagreement about. He looked, she thought, like someone who had spent 22 years managing rooms and had not yet fully processed that this was a room he could not manage. She watched Cash's opening. He was good. He attacked the forensic chain when isn't the chain attacked, and he raised the specter of institutional failure versus individual culpability, suggesting that if the evidence room was as poorly supervised as the prosecution alleged, then any number of errors could be attributed to systemic failure rather than deliberate fraud. He was measured and reasonable and did not once raise his voice. Vega noted which jurors were tracking his argument with the slight forward lean of engagement versus which were sitting back with the flattened affect of people who'd already decided something. She left before the lunch recess. She had a case to work. Her testimony came on a Thursday 2 weeks later. She sat in the witness chair and gave her name and badge number and length of service and answered the questions that Monroe's team had prepared her for, and then answered Cash's cross-examination, which was longer and more aggressive in a controlled, cuff-linked way. He asked her about her memory of the tag number. He spent 12 minutes on it. He was skilled enough not to be contemptuous. He was respectful in the way that contained contempt, the way that said, "I'm going to take this seriously precisely because the jury needs to see me taking it seriously before I dismantle it." Detective Vega, you're asking this jury to accept that you memorized, in passing, a 7-character alphanumeric code from a case file you looked at briefly 2 years prior. I'm asking the jury to accept what happened, she said. The ACE's records and the forensic accounting are what support the conclusion. I just noticed an inconsistency. Just noticed. Yes. In a single moment of contact with a box that was, by your own description, a fraction of an inch out of alignment. That's correct. He paused as though considering. It was a theatrical pause. Detective, would you characterize yourself as someone who looks for problems? She didn't answer immediately. Not because the question was difficult, but because she wanted to give it the weight it deserved, and because juries noticed when a witness answered too quickly and when a witness answered too carefully, and she'd spent enough time in these rooms to understand the difference. I'd characterize myself, she said, as someone who pays attention. Cash moved on. The verdict came back on a Tuesday, 11 weeks after the trial began. Guilty on 21 of 30 counts against Prout. Guilty on 18 of 22 against Ferris. The courtroom was quiet in the way courtrooms get quiet when something important happens, not the silence of shock but the silence of people absorbing something they've been waiting for and are now not entirely sure what to do with. Prout, when the first count was read, tilted his chin down slightly. His jaw worked once, a small grinding movement, and then stopped. He sat very still while the remaining counts were read. When the last one came, guilty, he put his hand flat on the defense table just once and then removed it. Cash immediately requested polling of the jury. Vega was in the gallery, 4th row. She watched Prout's back for 20 minutes. He never turned around. The sentencing was 4 months later. She didn't attend. She'd been given the date, but she had a witness interview that afternoon that she'd been working toward for 6 weeks and she wasn't going to cancel it. The interview mattered to a living person who needed it to matter. The sentencing was going to happen without her. She heard later, 18 years for Prout, 12 for Ferris. Bluth's reduced charge got him 18 months of supervised release and the end of his law enforcement career. 18 years? She turned that number over in her mind the same way she turned most numbers over, factual, specific, attached to things that had happened. Prout would be 65 when he was released. The 11 people who had died in those parking lots and on those sidewalks and in those streets were not going to be any age at all. The civil suits were already filed. Families of the deceased, represented by a consortium of civil rights attorneys who had arrived in Harwick within 72 hours of the federal indictment and had been in the city in some form ever since. The city's legal counsel had, per the most recent reporting Vega had seen, advised a settlement posture. What settlement meant in dollar terms was still being negotiated. What settlement meant in every other term was something that numbers couldn't really address, and Vega had been a detective long enough to know that numbers were what institutions reached for when everything else was inadequate. There was a community meeting, organized by 2 churches in the East Side District. Vega was invited by email through official channels. She didn't go, not because she didn't think it mattered, but because she knew what her presence would mean there. The detective who'd uncovered it, who'd done the right thing, the institutional representative of an institution that had failed these people catastrophically, and she didn't think her presence would serve anything that the people in that room needed. They didn't need a detective. They needed what the system was ill-equipped to provide and what it was going to attempt to approximate with money, which was not the same thing. She drove past one of the churches once on a route home she didn't usually take. It was evening. The lights inside were on and there were cars in the lot, and she could see, through the windows of the fellowship hall, the backs of people sitting in rows of folding chairs. She kept driving. Her knee got better in June, after she finally made the appointment she'd been putting off since November, and a sports medicine doctor told her she had mild patellar tendinopathy and gave her a set of exercises that took 12 minutes in the morning and actually worked. She did them every day mostly. Some mornings she forgot or didn't have time, and some mornings she did them while standing at her kitchen counter watching the light change outside the window over the sink. She had the same caseload she'd had before February. The burglary series had resolved, partly 3 of the 14 cases cleared by the arrest of 2 brothers in their mid-20s who'd been working a specific neighborhood and had been stupidly loyal to routine. 7 of the 14 remained open, possibly related, possibly not. The domestic violence case had gone to trial and ended in a hung jury on the aggravated assault count, which she'd been prepared for and was nevertheless grimly unsurprising. She was working a carjacking series in the West District and a rape case that was likely to take months and required a particular kind of patience, the kind where you knew you might not get there but you kept walking toward the destination anyway. She still went into the evidence room sometimes. She still noticed when boxes were out of alignment. She didn't think of this as a virtue or a curse or any particular thing. It was just what she noticed. The evidence unit now had 2 additional cameras, mounted to cover the blind spots that the original installation had missed. The new camera positions had been recommended by a consultant brought in after the federal investigation, a woman from Cincinnati who specialized in evidence room security and who had given the department a 40-page report. Vega had read it. It was thorough. It addressed most of what had happened procedurally. She thought sometimes about the gap between procedure and the thing that procedure was trying to protect against. Procedure was a net. It caught most of what it was designed to catch. The question was always the size of the gaps and who was patient enough to look for them. She thought about Roy Ferris, who was beginning his 12-year sentence at a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania. His daughter, who had been in the house when the arrest happened, had published a short essay in a Columbus newspaper about what it was to be a child of someone who had done what her father had done. Vega had read it twice. The daughter wrote carefully and with a refusal to perform either vindication or condemnation that Vega found, in some way she couldn't entirely articulate, admirable. The daughter's name was Alicia. She was 22. She was still finishing her degree. It was October when Vega went back to the section of the evidence room where she'd found the 1608W box. This wasn't intentional. She was down there on another audit routine and her route took her past that section of shelving and she slowed and looked. The box was gone. It had been retrieved by the federal investigation team months ago, along with everything else that had been tagged as relevant. The shelf where it had sat was occupied now by a box from a 2023 case, neatly labeled, properly aligned. She stood there for a moment. The HVAC was cycling. The fluorescents buzzed their quiet, sustaining buzz. Somewhere in the upper floors of the building, someone was moving furniture. She could hear it, a periodic deep scraping like the building rearranging itself. She thought about Marcus Webb, who had died on a sidewalk in 2016 with no weapon on him, and whose case had been closed as justifiable homicide, and whose family had spent 8 years with that determination attached to his name. She thought about the other 10 whose names she knew now had learned because it seemed like the minimum of what was owed them. Some of them had records, some of them hadn't. Some of them had been trying to get somewhere and some of them had been doing nothing at all. The specifics of their lives had no particular bearing on the specifics of what had been done to them, which was why the way the system sometimes used those specifics felt like a second injury. She stood there long enough that the HVAC cycled off and the room got quieter. She was aware of the cold, the particular dry refrigerated cold of the evidence room and her own breath, and the small sounds the building made around her. Then she picked up the new box, the 2023 case she was auditing, and carried it to the work table and opened it and went back to work. Outside, the city did what it did. Traffic moving on Belcher Avenue, a siren starting somewhere to the east and moving away, the October light falling at its particular autumn angle across the building's concrete facade, the light that made everything look like it was at the end of something. She checked the item list, she counted the items, she made a note. She stayed until she was finished.